Reflections on the Good News of Jesus Christ for the third Sunday of Lent, according to the Gospel of John. Since the Passover of the Jews was near, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. He found in the temple area those who sold oxen, sheep, and doves, as well as the money changers seated there. He made a whip out of cords and drove them all out of the temple area with the sheep and oxen, and spilled the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And to those who sold doves, he said, "Take these out of here and stop making my Father's house a marketplace." His disciples recalled the words of Scripture, "Zeal for your house will consume me." At this, the Jews said to him, "What sign can you show us for doing this?" And Jesus said to them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews said, "This temple has been under construction for 46 years, and you will raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking about the temple of his body. Therefore, when he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they came to believe the Scripture and the word Jesus had spoken. While he was in Jerusalem for the feast of Passover, many began to believe in his name when they saw the signs he was doing. But Jesus would not trust himself to them, because he knew them all and did not need anyone to testify about human nature. He himself understood it very well. The Gospel of the Lord. "Enough," she said, very sadly. This wasn't working. They had some wonderful times together, and he was a nice guy. But it was clear, at least to her, that she wanted different things out of life. So, with tears in her eyes and a smile on her face, she wished him well, and they parted. "Enough," he said with frustration. The project was going nowhere. They were wasting valuable time and resources. There were too many competing visions and goals, not to say egos. He decided to cancel the next meeting. Instead, he spoke one-on-one with each member of the team. He reviewed what needed to be done to move forward, and then he and the team member decided together whether he or she should continue working on the project. A smaller, more focused, and in sync group then brought the work to completion. We all reach the point of enough when we're tired of accepting less than what's possible, when what's right and just eludes us because of selfishness and avarice, when we refuse to remain silent any longer for the sake of complacency posing as peace. Jesus reaches that point of enough in today's gospel. Enough of the commerce and profit that has degraded the temple. The time had come to restore the temple as a place of prayer, of welcome and peace, of charity and kindness. The gospel presents a dramatic scene where Jesus shows himself as Lord of the temple. To us, it does not seem in character to see Jesus with a whip of cords physically driving out the traders in oxen, sheep, and doves, animals that would be used in temple sacrifices. But of course, first, they had to be paid for. Pilgrims from many different lands came to Jerusalem, especially in Passover time, bringing different kinds of money. but only Jewish coins could be used in the temple. Thus, the money changers were needed. There was an even more important reason. Roman coins bore the image of Divus Augustus, the divine Augustus, and so were regarded as idolatrous. They had to be exchanged for Jewish coinage. Jesus objected not to the trade as such, it was quite legitimate, but to its being done in the temple precincts, as he called it, my Father's house. Such business should have been carried on outside the temple precincts. But we know that in our own time, hawkers like to get as close to the action as possible, especially if they have competition. It is also quite possible that the temple authorities connived at the practice and may even have benefited if the traders had to rent spaces in the temple to do their business. Well, that's all well and good, but what does this story say to us? What Jesus does in the cleansing of the temple, my brothers and sisters, we must do in our lives. Enough of the merchants who try to sell us on a set of beliefs and values based on self-interest and greed. Enough of the money changers who shortchange us of the time and attention we want for family and friends. Enough of the useless, the meaningless, and the destructive that make our lives less than what God created them to be. And by the way, Jesus is truly seen here in a towering rage. He's not acting. Yes, there was nothing new about the buying and selling that was taking place in the temple. It had been going on for generations. And so had the corruption. Jesus' overturning of the vendors' booths and tables is a condemnation of the exploitation and injustice of the worshiping people in the name of God. His anger reminds us that anger as an emotion is not wrong in and of itself. And just because practices are long established does not mean that they should continue to be tolerated. There are things that we really should get angry about, such as injustice and inequality in our country and our world. How might God be calling you or me to express righteous anger as a step toward action? This story also shows us that Jesus did not come into our world simply to repeat the Ten Commandments. After all, God had given them to Moses some 12 centuries before Jesus ever arrived on the scene. But Jesus gave us a new commandment: love one another as I have loved you. You know something? Life would have been easier if he had just stuck with the original 10. Not that they aren't challenging enough by themselves. So, when I am preparing for confession, I might go down the list and admit, yeah, one of those and one of those. And, all right, a couple of those. But one of those? Never. So, that's not too bad. I guess I'm doing okay. But how am I doing with the great commandment? When can I ever say that I am always a loving person? I can't even get that out with a straight face because I know it isn't true. And those who know me also know it isn't true. In fact, I may have figured out a way to be very faithful to the Ten Commandments while not being very loving at all to the people around me in my daily life. Jesus' great commandment means that every day I am called to stretch a little further and try a little harder to become a more loving person. And the more I strive to live by that one great commandment, the more I will be fulfilling all of the commandments. But let's look briefly at just one of the original 10. I, the Lord, am your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, that place of slavery. You shall not have other gods besides me. You shall not bow down before them or worship them. Of course, back then, when the Israelites were still wandering in the desert after God brought them out of slavery in Egypt, the false idol they turned away from God to worship was a golden calf. Now, we would never be so naive as to worship a golden calf. No, in our time, we are far more sophisticated in the false idols that we worship, such idols as power, prestige, popularity, pleasure, possessions, positions, and, of course, profits. Any of those, or many other idols, can subtly take over the number one place in our lives, command the greatest part of our time, attention, and energy, and leave our relationship with others and God getting whatever crumbs are left over. If the Lord is truly my God, then that means none of those other things can be my God. They all have their place, yes, but none of them should be getting first place in my life. The more faithful I am to keeping the first commandment, the easier it will be to keep all the rest. But when it comes to commandments, we are a people given to exceptions and excuses. We're uncomfortable with all of the commandments. In fact, we're uncomfortable with law, duties, and responsibility. Context, individuality, personal choice, and private fulfillments dominate our moral discourse. It is no wonder, then, that commandments that seem to disregard our pleasure and instead offer us imperatives also seem easier to justify being ignored. We bridle at limits, especially moral limits. Our talk complains of guilt trips and warns us against the tyranny of the shoulds. But, as is often the case, we caution ourselves against the sins we are least likely to commit. Our problem is not that we are a guilt-ridden and scrupulous people. We are not self-denying ascetics. We are not crimped by moral confinement. In fact, it's just the opposite. We resist limits. We bristle at anything that might hold us responsible or duty-bound. And this not only means trouble for those around us, whether nations or neighbors, it also means trouble in recognizing the only true God. People or countries who delude themselves into thinking that they have no limits soon start thinking that they themselves are gods. There is more than one paradox in all of this. Each of the commandments, it can be said, is not some external and irrational fiat from an alien God. Rather, each is an expression of the truth God has made in us. If we worship idols or worship our work, if we covet person or property, if we dishonor those who have given us life, we not only reject the law of God, we destroy what we are. For the duty imposed on us by God is the duty to be true to what we are, limited, but deeply loved sons and daughters of God. The calendar, if not the weather, is telling us that it is almost spring, a traditional time for house cleaning. We don't have to go about it with the same gusto that Jesus did, but Lent and spring is a good time to take a long look at our lives and see what doesn't belong, what is distracting us from the really important things and people, what needs to be tossed out, gotten rid of, or at least put in its proper place. And what is it that especially needs our attention? It's anything that is keeping me from becoming a more loving person. That's what I need to give up, get rid of, not just for Lent, but for good. That's what Lent and life is calling all of us to. That's what God created us to be, people who live in God's love and share it with all those whose lives we touch. That's the great commandment that Jesus lived. He revealed the one true God, the God who is love. My brothers and sisters, let's not settle for anything less. Thanks for listening.